The autumn light was already failing when the hired chaise turned in at the great iron gates of Havering Court, and Margaret Ashcombe, pressing her gloved fingers to the cold glass, saw for the first time the house that was to be either her refuge or her ruin. It rose out of the gathering dusk like something carved from the sky, a vast gray pile of stone that had stood, the driver had told her, since the days of the first Elizabeth. The avenue ran straight for nearly half a mile between ranks of ancient limes, their leaves gone to rust and gold, and falling now in slow spirals across the gravel. Beyond the trees the park stretched away into mist, and rooks wheeled and cried above the chimneys against a sky the color of pewter. There was no warmth in that prospect, no lamp burning in welcome. Only the house, immense and indifferent, waiting. Margaret drew a slow breath and made herself sit very straight, as her father had taught her, whatever came. She was not a woman given to trembling, though she had reason enough that evening. She was 25, slight of figure, with ash-brown hair pinned plainly beneath a bonnet that had been turned and retrimmed more times than she cared to count, and she wore the gray of half-mourning. Her eyes were gray also, calm and level, the sort that had learned early to hide what lay behind them. 6 weeks ago she had knelt at the graveside of the only person in the world who had loved her, and had understood, in the terrible clarity of that moment, that she was now entirely alone, and entirely poor. The Reverend Thomas Ashcombe had been a good man and a scholar, gentle and unworldly, who had given away in charity what little he might have laid by, and who had died believing that Providence would somehow provide for his daughter. Providence had provided a stack of unpaid tradesmen's bills, a library that fetched less at auction than the cost of the auctioneer, and the plain fact that a gentlewoman without fortune, connection, or husband has 3 roads open to her: to be a governess, despised in the schoolroom and forgotten in the parlor; to teach in some cold seminary and grow old correcting other women's children; or to become a paid companion to some lady of rank, in exchange for her bread and a roof and the dignity, such as it was, of a gentlewoman's dress. Margaret had chosen the last, because it was the last that had chosen her. The living had passed to a stranger, the vicarage must be given up within the month, and in the newspaper there had been an advertisement and a correspondence through a solicitor's clerk, and at the end a curt letter informing Miss Ashcombe that the Dowager Countess of Havering would receive her upon trial, and that she was to present herself before the 1st of October. No word of welcome, no mention of terms beyond the barest. And now the 1st of October had come, gray and cold, and here was the house. The chaise drew up not at the great front door, but at a lesser entrance to the side, half hidden by a yew hedge grown wild. The door, Margaret understood without being told, by which persons of her uncertain station were expected to come and go. She gathered her small trunk herself, and stood a moment on the gravel in the falling dusk, feeling the cold strike up through the thin soles of her boots. Then the side door opened, throwing out a narrow wedge of candlelight, and a woman stood in it, holding a lamp. "Miss Ashcombe, is it?" "It is." "Good evening. You're expected." The woman said it as one states a fact of no particular pleasure. She was stout, past 50, with iron-gray hair drawn back beneath a plain cap and a face that had settled long ago into lines of tight-lipped watchfulness. A great ring of keys hung at her waist and chimed softly as she moved. "I'm Mrs. Fenn, housekeeper here. You'd best come in out of the cold." Margaret stepped across the threshold, and the door was shut behind her, and the great house closed about her like a fist. The passage within was stone-flagged and narrow, and it smelled of cold stone and beeswax and, faintly, of wood smoke from fires burning far off in rooms Margaret would likely never see. They went along it in silence until they came to a small square sitting room where a modest fire burned. Here Mrs. Fenn set down the lamp and looked at Margaret fully for the first time, from the worn gray bonnet to the mended hem and back to the pale, composed face. "You're young," she said at length, as though it were an accusation. "I am 25, younger than the last, and the one before her." Mrs. Fenn folded her hands over the keys. "You'll take a dish of tea. You look perished, and there's no use presenting yourself to her ladyship looking like a drowned thing. She'll not thank you for it. It was not kindness, precisely, there was too much sharpness in it for that. But it was not unkindness either, and Margaret, who had not eaten since a wretched inn breakfast many miles behind her, felt a warmth steal into her chest. "Thank you," she said. "You are very good. I'm nothing of the sort. I'm practical." But she busied herself at the hob, and presently there was hot, strong tea and a slice of seed cake, and Margaret ate and drank while the housekeeper watched her with folded arms. It was Margaret who broke the silence, for it seemed to her better to know the worst of a thing than to sit in ignorance of it. "Mrs. Fenn, you said I was younger than the last, and the one before her. How many have there been? Companions to her ladyship?" For a moment she thought the housekeeper would not answer. Then she said flatly, "6. 6. In 2 years." Mrs. Fenn turned from the fire, and there was something almost grim, almost warning, in the set of her plain gray face. "You'd best hear it from me, miss, and hear it plain, for you'll get no honesty from the family. Her ladyship has driven off 6 companions in 2 years, and not one lasted above 4 months, and 2 not above 4 weeks. There was Miss Pring, that cried in the passages and gave notice before the month was out. There was the widow Cathcart, that her ladyship said had a face like a boiled pudding and sent packing after 9 days. There was a proud Frenchwoman broken inside a fortnight, and 3 others besides. You take my meaning. I take it," Margaret said quietly. "Do you?" The housekeeper came a step nearer and lowered her voice. "Her ladyship is a hard woman. She was always sharp, but since her illness she has grown past all bearing. She has a tongue that would flay the hide off a bull, and she uses it on any that come within reach. She is in pain a great part of the time, though she'd sooner die than own it, and she takes it out on those about her. And the more you try to please her, the more she scorns you for the trying. She will find out the thing you are proudest of and make sport of it, and the thing you are most ashamed of, and name it aloud. The truth of it, miss, is that she does not want a companion. She wants a body to bait." The fire hissed. Somewhere far off a door closed, and the sound came faint and hollow along the stone passages. Margaret sat very still and did not flinch. And yet they keep sending her companions. "They keep sending them," Mrs. Fenn agreed, "because a lady of her rank cannot be left to sit alone, and because there are those in this family that find it convenient she should be kept sweet, or kept from thinking overmuch on how her affairs are ordered. But that's no matter of yours." She straightened, and the keys chimed. "I tell you all this not to frighten you off, but because you seem a sensible sort of body, and it's only fair you should go up those stairs knowing what waits at the top." The others were not warned. I'll not have it said I sent a 7th lamb to the slaughter with her eyes shut. "I am grateful to you," Margaret said, and meant it. "It is better to know." "Aye, maybe it is." Mrs. Fenn regarded her a moment longer. "You've a steady way with you. But steadiness wears thin under a tongue like hers. Don't be thinking your calm face will save you. Nothing saves anybody in this house that her ladyship's made up her mind against." Margaret was silent a moment. Then she said, in her low, even voice, "I have nowhere else to go." Mrs. Fenn. She had not meant to say it. It came out plainly, without self-pity, and perhaps it was the very plainness of it that gave the housekeeper pause. Mrs. Fenn looked at her, and the hard gray eyes held hers a long moment, and something passed between the two women that neither named, a recognition of the narrow and unlovely roads a woman without money must walk, and the courage it takes to walk them with the back straight. "No, Mrs." Fenn said at last, more gently. "No, I don't suppose you have. There's few enough of us that do." She took up the lamp. "Well, warm yourself. Her ladyship sits late of an evening, and she'll want the first cut at you tonight, before you've so much as unpacked your box. Best get it over. The waiting for a thing like this is worse than the meeting of it." Margaret rose and drew off her worn gloves and smoothed the front of her gray gown with hands that were, she was quietly proud to note, quite steady. She caught sight of herself in the small clouded glass above the mantel, a slight figure in shabby mourning, pale, plain, a girl 100 grand people would have looked straight through as though she were window glass. And she thought of her father, of the way he had used to say that the measure of a soul was not in what befell it, but in how it bore what befell it. She thought, too, with a small, hard flame of something almost like defiance, that she had buried the one person who loved her and survived it, and watched her home stripped and sold about her and survived that, and that if a sharp-tongued old woman imagined she could be broken in a fortnight by unkind words, she might yet find she had misjudged her seventh lamb. "I am ready," she said. Mrs. Fenn gave her one last look, long, appraising, not unkindly, and something in it seemed to weigh her and, for the first time, to find her not entirely wanting. "We shall see," said the housekeeper. "Come along, then, and mind the third stair. It's worn to a slope, and it's taken better women than you off their feet. Keep close behind the lamp." And she opened the door upon the cold passage and the waiting dark, and Margaret Ashcombe, gathering her courage about her like a thin cloak against the chill, followed the small chiming light up into the great silent house, toward the room where the Dowager Countess of Havering sat waiting, in her black lace cap, with her silver-headed cane and her sharp black eyes, to take the measure of the woman who had come to serve her. The door of the sick room opened before her like the lid of a box she was not sure she wished to see inside. Mrs. Fenn went first, and Margaret followed into a room so thick with heat and shadow that for a moment she could see nothing at all. The curtains were half drawn against the low sun. A fire burned high, and the air was heavy with camphor and dried lavender and the close medicinal smell of a room lived in too long by one who did not leave it. Margaret stood very still and let her eyes adjust, her chin level. "The young person, my lady," said Mrs. Fenn, in the flat voice of a woman who had learned to give nothing away. "Miss Ashcombe." For a long moment nothing answered but the fire. Then, from the great canopied bed against the far wall, came a voice, dry, precise, and edged like a paper cut. "Bring her here. I cannot be expected to inspect what I cannot see. Or does she imagine I shall cross the room to her?" Margaret came forward at an even pace, neither hurrying like a frightened housemaid nor lingering as though the summons were beneath her, and made her curtsy, and raised her eyes to the woman who held her livelihood in one thin hand. The Dowager Countess of Havering was propped against a bank of pillows in a froth of yellowing lace, very old and very frail and entirely, ferociously awake. Her face was a fine ruin of folds and hollows, and out of it 2 eyes, black and wet and bright as a bird's, fixed upon Margaret and did not blink. One hand, all knuckle and vein and loose rings, rested upon the silver head of a cane laid along the coverlet, as though even in bed she would not be parted from it. "So," said Lady Beatrice, "you are the vicar's daughter." "I am, my lady." "Come nearer the light. I am told you are 25. You have the look of more." The black eyes traveled down her, slowly, with the frank, unhurried insolence of a woman who has long since ceased to fear being thought rude. Half mourning. "For the father. How long has he been dead?" 4 months, my lady, 4 months. "And already you are out at hire." The old woman's mouth curved, not kindly. "The grief cannot lie very deep, then, if it may be laid aside for wages within the season." It was meant to cut, and it cut. Margaret felt the small cold shock of it, and was aware of Mrs. Fenn by the door growing very still, the way one grows still near a thing that may go off. She understood quite suddenly that she was being tested, that the whole of this heat and shadow and studied insolence was a gate, and that the old woman was waiting to see whether she would batter at it in tears or charm it open with lies. She did neither. "My grief lies where it will, my lady," she said, and her voice was low and even and did not shake. "It does not ask my leave, and it does not consult my purse. But my father is dead, and I am not, and the living have the inconvenient habit of continuing to require bread. He would have thought it a poor tribute to his memory if I had sat down in the churchyard to starve beside him. He had no patience with waste." There was a silence. The fire cracked. The black eyes had not moved from her face, and something had come into them now, not warmth but attention, a sudden sharpening, as a cat sharpens when the thing it had thought a leaf turns out to be a mouse. "He had no patience with waste," Lady Beatrice repeated slowly. "A vicar who preached economy. How very novel. They generally preach charity, which is the same thing recommended to other people." She let the cane's head turn under her palm. "And what did your economical father leave you, besides a sharp tongue and a grey gown?" "A box of books, my lady. His watch, which I have not sold. And the habit of telling the truth, which he found saved a great deal of trouble in the end, though it cost something at the beginning." "Did he?" The gaze flicked to Mrs. Fenn and back. "We shall see how long the habit survives Havering. Truth is a luxury, girl. It is very well for a vicarage, where there is nothing worth lying about. In a great house it is otherwise." She shifted against the pillows with a small grimace of pain quickly mastered, and her voice, when it came again, was thinner and more venomous, as though the discomfort had to be paid off in cruelty. "You have no fortune. You have no beauty to speak of. You are, in short, precisely the sort of genteel pauper who comes to a house like this to flatter an old woman into her grave in the hope of a legacy. Tell me why I should not send you back on the carrier's cart tomorrow and be rid of the expense of you." Margaret did not look away. "I can give you no reason at all, my lady, if flattery is what you are hiring. There will be women better at it than I. I have watched people flatter the dying before. It is an ugly thing to watch, and I think, though you will not thank me for saying so, that you are too clever to enjoy it for long. But if you should want someone who will read to you without stumbling, and see that your fire is made up and your medicine given at the proper hour, and answer you honestly and hold her tongue when you wish it, then I can do that, and do it well, and I shall not pretend to love you in order to do it. Whether that is worth a place and a wage is for you to decide. I only came to say that I do not haggle for it with lies. She heard, behind her, the smallest sound from Mrs. Fenn, a breath drawn in and held. The old countess stared at her, and then, astonishingly, she began to laugh. It was not a pleasant laugh. It was thin and cracked and dissolved almost at once into a fit of coughing that bent her double, and Margaret was across to the bed before she had decided to move, putting the glass into the near hand and steadying it until the fit passed. When it eased, Lady Beatrice drank and lay back and regarded her over the rim of the glass with something very nearly, though not quite, amusement. "You did not ask my leave to touch me," she observed. "No, my lady. You were choking." I find that people who are choking rarely resent being helped once they have finished. Impertinent. Yes, my lady. If you would rather I let you choke in future, you have only to say so, and I shall stand by the door and watch. The corner of the withered mouth twitched. The others did not last a week. The last one wept when I told her her cap was crooked. The one before pretended not to hear when I asked whether my nephew had written, because she supposed I should not like the answer. And I do not keep liars to spare my feelings. I have a great many feelings, and every one of them is disagreeable, and I am too old to be improved. Do you understand? I believe I begin to, my lady. Then understand this also. The Cane's head turned, and the black eyes were suddenly hard as jet. I am dying. Do not contradict me. It is tedious, and it insults us both. It is taking an unconscionable time about it, and I am bored, which is a worse affliction at my age than the dying is. Everyone about me is either afraid of me or waiting for me, and the two wear very, very much the same face. My nephew writes me letters full of his affection, and I can hear the counting house behind every word like a clock behind a curtain. My physician tells me what he thinks I wish to hear. My servants creep. I am surrounded, girl, by people managing me. And you come in off the carrier's cart and tell me you will not pretend to love me. The voice dropped, and for a moment something bleak and honest looked out of the ruined face. Do you know, it is the first thing anyone has said to me in a 12-month that I have entirely believed. Margaret said nothing. She had learned when silence was the only decent answer. You will stay, said Lady Beatrice abruptly, for a month. We shall see. I make no promises, and if you bore me, I shall turn you off without a character and enjoy the doing of it, so do not grow comfortable. Fenn, she is to have the blue room off the passage where I can ring for her at night, not the attic. I will not have my reader coming down in the mornings gray from cold. It is depressing, and I do enough depressing looking as it is. The black eyes came back to Margaret. You may take off your bonnet. You are engaged. For the present. Thank you, my lady. Do not thank me. It is the worst place in 3 counties, and you will earn every penny of it in misery. Now a thin hand gestured toward a small table where a book lay face down upon its splayed leaves. My eyes are gone for reading by candle. The last girl left off in the middle of a chapter, and I have been in a temper about it for a week, for I could not remember whether the wretched man married the woman or drowned her. Sit there. Where I can see your face, I like to see whether a reader understands what she reads or only barks it like a dog at a gate. Read. So Margaret took off her bonnet and drew the low chair to the place indicated and took up the book. It was a novel, and not a very good one, full of swooning heiresses and wicked guardians. She found her place, and she read well. She had read aloud all her life, to her father when his eyes tired, to the old and failing in cottages, to children in the vestry on wet Sunday afternoons, and knew how to give a sentence its shape without making a performance of herself. The fire settled, and the light behind the curtains thinned from gold to gray, and the old woman lay with her black eyes half closed and her hand upon the cane, listening, truly listening, and not merely enduring the sound. Once, when Margaret read a line of especial foolishness, the heroine declaring she would sooner die than wed without love, the dowager gave a short, dry snort. "There speaks a woman who has never wanted a dinner," she said to no one, and Margaret allowed herself the smallest smile behind the page, and saw out of the tail of her eye that the old woman had noted it, and had not disliked it. When at last Lady Beatrice slept, not gently, but all at once, the way the very old and the very ill drop out of the world, her breath a thin whistle, Margaret read to the end of the sentence in a lowered voice, and only then closed the book. She sat a moment in the shadowed heat, looking at the sleeping face, the imperious ruin of it gone slack and old and, in sleep, almost afraid. Then she rose without a sound, made up the fire, moved the glass within easy reach of the bed, and went softly to the door. Mrs. Fenn was waiting in the passage. She looked at Margaret a long moment in the gray light, her tight mouth working over some thought she did not speak, and then said only, "She has not stayed awake so long for a reader in a year," and turned and led the way down. And Margaret, following the stout gray back along the dim-paneled passages past the shrouded furniture and the darkened portraits of Havering's long dead, understood that a door had opened for her, and did not yet guess how narrow or how strange or how watched by grasping eyes the room beyond it would prove to be. The narrow-leaded windows of the dowager's morning room had gone the color of pewter, and beyond them the beeches were shedding their gold in long, slow gusts. Margaret sat where she had been bidden, at the fire's edge, with her work-basket on her knee and a length of gray wool spooling through her fingers, and waited, as she had learned to wait, for whatever the old woman would give her. For a long while Lady Beatrice gave her nothing. She sat propped among her cushions with the cane laid across her lap like a scepter, her black lace cap trembling with the small, perpetual tremor of her head. Margaret had come to understand these silences. They were not the sullen silences of the sick room meant to punish. They were the silences of a woman who had spent 60 years being watched and waited upon, and had discovered, late, that the only company she could now abide was the sort that did not require her to perform. "You do not fidget," the dowager said at last, without turning her head. "I have had 6 of you before this." Every one of them fidgeted. They rustled and sighed and crept about straightening things that were not crooked, so that a body could not hear herself think. "You sit like a stone. I cannot decide whether it is dignity or stupidity." "It may be either, my lady," Margaret said, and did not look up from her wool. "I have not yet been here long enough to know myself." There was a small dry sound that might, in a warmer woman, have been a laugh. "Impertinent. Your father taught you that, I suppose. A country parson." "They are all impertinent, country parsons, under the meekness. It is the only rebellion left to a poor man who must smile at the squire." "My father smiled at very few people," Margaret said. "He said a man who smiled easily was generally selling something." The black eyes came round to her, quick as a bird's. "Did he? And what was your father selling, that he smiled so little?" "Nothing that anyone wished to buy, my lady. Patience, forbearance, the forgiveness of debts. He died owing money to the wine merchant and the coal man both, and the only thing he left me was a good name in a parish that could not eat it." She had not meant to say so much, but the old woman drew speech out of a person the way a poultice draws heat, and Margaret had learned that a small honest confidence was taken, grudgingly, for coin. "A good name," the dowager repeated, and turned back to the window. "Yes, they told me the same. when I was a girl and had nothing else to bring but the Wexford name, old and cold and empty as a church in Lent. A good name buys you a husband buried in the same vault as his 3 dead brothers, and a house full of his relations waiting for you to follow him into it. I have had 50 years to grow tired of my good name, girl. You may have it, if you like. I shall leave it to you in my will, along with the black lace and the gout." It was said in the flat-cutting manner she used for everything, and a lesser listener might have taken it for mere sourness. But Margaret heard beneath it the thin, cold current of an old grief, running deep under the ice of the woman's temper, and she said nothing, and let it run. They sat so until the light failed, and Mrs. Fenn came with the lamps. It was 3 days after this that Mr. Julian Hartwell called at Havering Court, and Margaret met him for the first time. She had heard the name. One could not spend a month under that roof and not hear it, spoken always in a particular manner, by the servants with a guarded respect, by the dowager with an edge Margaret could not at first interpret, half fondness and half something almost like anger. He managed the neighboring lands that marched with Havering along the river, and the dowager's home farm too, these 5 years, since her own steward had grown too old and dishonest to be trusted, and he did it, by all accounts, without fee and without thanks, out of some obscure sense of family obligation no one at Havering seemed able to name. He came on a gray afternoon with the first true cold of the season riding in on his coat, and Margaret, crossing the great stone hall on an errand for barley water, came upon him unlooked for, as Mrs. Fenn was taking his hat. He was tall, tall enough that he had to stoop under the low arch of the screen's passage, and dark-haired, with the weathered brown about the eyes of a man who spent his days out of doors, dressed plainly and well. He was not handsome in any easy way. His was the grave face of a man who had learned young to keep his own counsel, and never afterward seen a reason to unlearn it. But there was something in the steadiness of him, in the way he stood in that cold echoing hall as though he had every right to be there and no wish to presume upon it, that made Margaret pause a half-step in her crossing. "Mrs. Fenn," he said, and his voice was low and even. "The Countess is well, I hope." "As well as she is." "As well as she is, sir," the housekeeper answered, with a small tight smile that was, for Mrs. Fenn, nearly warmth. "Which is to say she quarreled with the doctor on Tuesday and put him out of the house, so I'd call her mending." Then, catching sight of Margaret, Miss Ashcombe. "This is Mr. Hartwell, come on the farm business." "Miss Ashcombe is the Countess's companion, sir." He turned. His dark gray eyes went over her once, not with the frank appraising look that weighs a woman's face and gown and prospects in a breath, but with a quieter attention, taking in the gray half-mourning, the plainly pinned hair, the workaday cuffs, and understanding all of it, she thought, and drawing no conclusion aloud. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, and inclined his head. "You have a difficult post." It was not what she had expected. The people who spoke to her of her post generally spoke of her good fortune and expected to be agreed with. "It is the post I have, sir," she said. "I find it suits me better than I feared." Something moved at the corner of his grave mouth, not a smile, but the ghost of where a smile might one day stand. "That is more than most who have held it could say. I knew 2 of your predecessors a little. Neither lasted the winter. I hope you are made of harder stuff, for her ladyship's sake as much as your own. She is not easy. But she is worth the difficulty to those who have the patience for her." "I have found her so," Margaret said simply, and saw in the flicker of his glance that the answer had told him something. "Mr. Hartwell." The voice came thin and imperious down the stair-well, and they all 3 looked up. The dowager stood at the turn of the great staircase, one claw-thin hand on the banister, the other on her cane, her black cap and gown making her, against the gray stone, a small, fierce figure of judgment. Are you come to stand in my hall making love to the companion, or are you come to tell me what my land has done this quarter? I have been waiting a full 10 minutes, and I do not wait for kings. You have never waited for anyone in your life, ma'am, Hartwell said, unruffled, and Margaret saw that he was one of the very few who spoke to the old woman without either flinching or fawning, and that this was why she suffered him. I am come with the accounts. Miss Ashcombe was good enough to receive my hat. Mrs. Fenn received your hat. Miss Ashcombe was fetching my barley water, which is now cold. Well, come up, both of you. Hartwell, you may give me the bad news, for there is always bad news, and Ashcombe, you may sit and learn how a great house eats itself alive from the inside, which is an education worth more than anything your poor father taught you out of his books. They went up. And Margaret, following the slow, painful ascent of the old woman with a hand ready at her elbow, was aware of Hartwell a step behind her, of the quiet solidity of him, and of the fact, which she noted and then deliberately set aside, that he had adjusted his own long stride, so as not to crowd the two women on the narrow stair. In the small upstairs parlor that the dowager kept for business, Hartwell laid out his ledgers and read to her the state of the year, the barley in, the wheat middling, 2 cottages wanting new thatch, a dispute over a boundary hedge with the Marsden farm that he had settled by giving away 6 feet of ground not worth the quarrel. The dowager listened with her eyes half shut, interrupting now and then with a question so sharp and so exactly to the point that Margaret revised upward her estimate of the old woman's mind by a considerable degree. Whatever the body had become, the wit inside it was whole and cold and formidable as ever. 6 feet to Marsden, the dowager said, when he had done. You are too soft, Julian. Your great-uncle would have gone to law and spent £300 to keep 6 feet of nettles, on the principle of the thing. My great-uncle spent a great deal on the principle of the thing, Hartwell said mildly, and I have spent 5 years untangling what it cost him. I would rather keep the peace with Marsden and the 6 feet in hay. But it is your ground, ma'am, and your decision. I only give you my counsel. Your counsel. She turned the word over. Yes, you always give me your counsel, and never anything else. Not a request. Not a hint. 5 years you have managed my land as though it were your own, better than your own. And you have never once asked me for what any other man in your place would have been at my throat for since the day my husband died. Her voice had sharpened. Something old and buried was coming up through the cold ground of her. Why is that, Julian? I am an old woman, and I shall be dead before the daffodils, and I should like, once, to hear you say plainly the thing we have both known these 5 years. There was a silence in the little room. The fire ticked. Beyond the window the beeches let go another slow gust of gold. Margaret sat very still over her work, understanding that she was present at something she had not been meant to see, and that to rise and go now would be a greater intrusion than to remain quiet. You know why, ma'am? Hartwell said at last, and his voice had not changed, but something in the stillness of him had. Because it is not mine to ask for. Your husband's estate goes where the law and his will send it. I am the wrong branch of the tree. Osric is the heir. That has been settled since before I was breeched, and no amount of my keeping your thatch dry will alter one line of it. I did not come to Havering to be looked at as a claimant. I came because there was work here that wanted doing, and no one else to do it honestly. And because, he paused, and for the first time the evenness of his voice showed a crack. "Hairline fine. Because you were kind to a boy once, ma'am. A long while ago, when there was very little kindness going in this family, and I have not forgotten it, whatever you may choose to believe of me." The dowager did not answer at once. Her sharp eyes had gone bright and wet at their rims, though her face did not soften. If anything, it grew fiercer, as the faces of the proud do when they are near to feeling. Margaret, glancing up despite herself, saw the old woman's hand tighten on the cane until the knuckles stood white as bone. "Kind," Lady Beatrice said, and the word came out with a strange broken scorn. "I was never kind. Ask the 6 who ran from me. I was only—" She stopped, and her mouth worked, and she mastered it. "There was a boy who reminded me of someone I had lost, and I was less unkind to him than to the rest. That is all. Do not make a virtue of it. I cannot abide to have virtues laid at my door. At my age, I have no room to store them." But she had said someone I had lost, and Margaret, bent again over her gray wool, understood that she had been given the near edge of the old woman's long-buried grief. A lost someone, never named, standing behind 50 years of sharpness like a figure behind a curtain, and she folded the knowledge away in silence. Presently, the business was done. Hartwell gathered his papers, bowed over the dowager's thin hand with a grave courtesy that plainly cost her more to receive than she would show, and took his leave. At the door he paused and turned, and his dark gray eyes found Margaret's. "Miss Ashcombe, I ride over most Thursdays on the accounts. I hope I shall find you still here. Come the next." It was said with perfect propriety, a mere civility, and yet there was underneath it unmistakable to her, a genuine wish that she should not be one of the ones who ran. "I expect you shall, sir," Margaret said. "I have nowhere else that wants me, and her ladyship's barley water will not fetch itself." This time the ghost of the smile very nearly became the thing itself. He inclined his head and was gone, and she heard his boots go down the stone stair, and then the great door far below, and then the fading of a horse's hooves on the gravel, going out under the shedding beeches into the gray afternoon. "He is the best man in this county," the dowager said abruptly from her cushions, "and he will have nothing of it. There is a great fortune not 15 miles off would take him tomorrow. Land and money and a foolish pretty girl to go with it, and he will not stir himself, because he has some notion that a man with no expectations has no business courting. Idiot. The good ones are always idiots. It is how you tell them from the others." Her black eyes came round to Margaret. "You watched him." "I watched you both, my lady," Margaret said steadily, taking up the barley water tray. "It was difficult not to. You were saying important things." The old woman studied her a moment longer, with that bird-quick shrewdness, and whatever she saw she kept to herself. "Fetch me that cold barley water back, and do not let Fen make it fresh. It is a waste, and I have wasted enough today. Sit down, girl. The light is going, and I do not care to be alone with the dark just yet. You may read to me. Not the sermons. I have had enough of forgiveness for one afternoon." And Margaret set down the tray and drew her low chair nearer to the failing fire and began to read into the gathering dusk, while outside the last of the gold came down from the beeches, and the first hard frost of the year crept whitening across the darkening lawns of Havering Court. The autumn light had thinned to a pale watery gold by the morning the Wexfords came, and Margaret, standing at the tall window of the small parlor, with a mending basket forgotten in her hands, watched the traveling carriage sweep up the long avenue with a sensation that was not quite dread and not quite resignation, but something composed of both. She had known they would come. The dowager had known it too, and had said so the evening before, tapping the cane against the arm of her chair. "My nephew smells a deathbed the way a crow smells a fallen lamb," she had said. "He will be here within the week, and he will bring that gilded wife of his, and they will sit in my house and count my spoons and wait for me to have the courtesy to die. Do not let them frighten you, girl. They frighten everyone. It is their only accomplishment." Now the carriage drew up before the great door, and Margaret went out into the hall, because Mrs. Fenn had the linen airing, and the dowager was not yet risen, and someone must receive them. And it fell, as everything uncounted and unthanked fell, to her. Mr. Osric Wexford descended first, florid and heavy, wrapped in a many-caped traveling coat of fashionable bottle green. He looked up at the gray face of Havering Court with the frank appraising eye of a man inspecting a property he considered as good as his own, his gaze traveling over it as a butcher's eye travels over a beast, weighing the cuts. Behind him came his wife. Cordelia Wexford stepped down onto the gravel as though she expected a carpet to be laid beneath her. Her pale gold hair dressed high beneath a ribbon-trimmed bonnet, her jeweled fingers already drawing off her gloves. She was handsome in the brittle, polished way of a woman who has made a study of being handsome. And when her eyes fell upon Margaret, her smile arrived at once, swift and dazzling, and entirely without warmth. The practiced smile she kept, Margaret understood in an instant, for servants and small dogs and other creatures beneath her serious attention. "Ah," said Cordelia, drawing the syllable out. "You will be the companion. The Ashby, was it?" "Ashcombe, yes." She said the name as one might name a village one had passed through and did not intend to visit again. "Have someone see to the boxes. The green one is not to be tipped. There is glass in it, and I shall want hot water in my chamber, and not the tepid stuff one gets in these old houses." "Where is my aunt?" "Lady Wexford is not yet risen, madam," Margaret said, in the level, unhurried voice she had learned kept its own dignity when nothing else could. "She rested poorly in the night. Mrs. Fenn will have your rooms made ready directly. If you will come into the morning room, there is a fire, and I will send for refreshment." "Poorly," Osric repeated, handing his hat to Margaret as though she were the footman, so that she was obliged either to take it or let it fall, and she took it, because a dropped hat was a small indignity and she had learned to choose which were worth the refusing. "She is much reduced, then, my poor aunt." He arranged his heavy features into an expression intended for grief and achieving only impatience. "We came the moment we had Fenn's letter," and he passed into the morning room without waiting to be led, with the assurance of a man walking into rooms he had already, in the counting-house of his mind, inherited. They established themselves with a speed and thoroughness that would have been admirable had it been decent. Within 2 days the Wexfords had spread themselves through the quiet house like damp through plaster. Osric took possession of the library and the good chair by its fire, and the best of the late Earl's port, and rang the bell at all hours. Cordelia commandeered the south sitting-room, complained of its draughts, and set the maids to a frenzy of fetching that left the whole staff frayed to the bone. And through all of it, Margaret moved quietly, doing what she had always done, reading to the dowager, warming her possets, seeing that the fire in her chamber never sank, and it did not take Cordelia above a single dinner to make plain precisely where she considered Margaret to stand in the order of the house. For Margaret was not asked to dine with the family. That first evening she had come down in her usual plainness, and Cordelia had looked at her with lifted brows and said, sweetly, "Oh, surely you take your meals with Mrs. Fenn? I am sure you are far more comfortable so. We are quite a family party, you understand." and there had been nothing to do but incline her head and withdraw, and eat her supper in the housekeeper's room while Mrs. Fenn pressed her lips together and said nothing, which was her way of saying a very great deal. It was not the exclusion that told, for Margaret cared little where she took her mutton. It was the small, ceaseless establishing of place, the way Cordelia would hand Margaret her shawl to carry on the stair, the way Osric would speak of her across the room in the third person, as though she were a piece of furniture that happened to be able to fetch things. She bore it, because she had not come to Havering for gentle usage, and because the woman upstairs needed her, and because a person's worth, her father had used to say, is not a thing that others can add to or take away with their manners. It is only a thing they reveal in themselves by how they choose to treat it. But she watched them, and what she saw hardened something in her that had been, until now, only pity. For they did not love the dowager, nor even trouble to pretend to, except in her presence, and there the pretense was so thin that Margaret marveled the old lady could bear it without laughing outright. Margaret came upon them one afternoon in the library, not meaning to overhear and unable. Once she had begun to stop, she had come for a book, and the door stood ajar, and Osric's heavy voice carried into the passage. Cannot go on forever, Cordelia. The woman is 80 if she is a day, and Cranmer says the heart is worn quite out. It is only a question of managing matters until she goes. And you are certain of the will. Cordelia's voice was cooler, harder, the voice she did not spend on servants. You told me you were certain. Of course I am certain. There is no one else. I am the nephew. I am the blood. The entail on the land is broken, but the personality comes to me by every rule of sense and nature. She has not a friend in the world but her physician and her lawyer, and lawyers and physicians are not left fortunes. Old women, said Cordelia, are sentimental. They leave money to cats' homes and to chapels and to companions who read to them prettily and warm their feet. I do not like the girl Osric. She is too quiet by half. The quiet ones are the ones who scheme. Margaret stood very still in the cold passage with the dowager's book in her hands and felt the words go through her like the draught under the door, not because they wounded her, but because of what lay beneath them. The cold, unhurried arithmetic of two people apportioning a living woman's death, discounting the possibility that she might be loved, because they had never once considered loving her. She is a paid drudge and nothing more, Osric said. But you are right. It will do no harm to be pleasant to the old woman while she lasts. We must be attentive, devoted. Cordelia, my love, you must be seen to sit with her. And there was a scrape of a chair, and Margaret withdrew before she could be discovered, walking soft-footed back along the passage with her heart beating hard and slow. She gave the dowager her book, and said nothing of what she had heard, only stayed a little longer than usual at the bedside, and warmed the thin old hands between her own when she thought the old lady dozing. She was not dozing. You have a face like a shut door this evening, Ashcombe, the dowager said, without opening her eyes. What have they done? Nothing, madam. Do not lie to me. I have no patience left for lies. I have spent it all on truths, which are cheaper and last longer. What have they done? They have been, Margaret said carefully, attentive, at that the black eyes opened, and something moved in them that was almost a smile, if a smile could be made entirely of iron. Attentive, yes. Osric was attentive at his father's deathbed too. He counted the plate before the man was cold, and married that painted creature within the year for her £4,000, and has spent it and looks now to spend mine. She fixed Margaret with a long look. And you, girl, what do you make of it? The truth. You have heard something. It is written all over that quiet face of yours." And Margaret, who had meant to shield her, found that she could not lie to those eyes, and so she said, "Lo, I heard Mr. Wexford say, madam, that it was only a question of managing matters until you were gone. And Mrs. Wexford said that you would be sat with now, and attended to. That is all. I ought not to repeat it. I am sorry." For a long moment the dowager said nothing. Outside, the wind moved in the bare elms, and somewhere below Cordelia's light laugh floated up, gay and false as a painted flower. And then the old woman laughed too, a short dry sound like the crackle of a dead leaf, and closed her eyes. "Good, you did not spare me. Do you know, girl, in 50 years I do not think a single soul has told me a hard truth to my face and looked sorry for it after. They have flattered me, or feared me, or fed me lies with a spoon. But they have not," she stopped, and her thin fingers tightened around Margaret's. "Never mind, send Fen to me when you go down." And in the morning she paused, and when she spoke again her voice had dropped to a low deliberateness that made Margaret look at her sharply. "In the morning I shall want to write to London, to my man of business. You will fetch me my writing desk and my seals and paper, and then, Ashcombe, you will go out and let no one in, no one, do you hear? Not that florid fool, nor his gilded magpie, nor Fen herself, until I ring. Can you do that?" "Yes, madam, whatever you may hear said of it after. Whatever they may ask you. You saw nothing and you carried nothing. You are only the drudge who reads to me, are you not? The quiet one who schemes." And there was such dark amusement in the old sharp face that Margaret, despite everything, felt her own mouth answer it, gravely, "Yes, madam, I am only that." So the letter went to London, sealed with the dowager's own hand under a great blot of black wax, and carried down by Margaret herself to the man who rode to the post, past the library door, where Osric sat with his port and his certainty. And neither of the Wexfords marked the plain grey figure going by with a letter held close against her side, for they had long since ceased to see her at all, which was the one small power that being invisible conferred. And within the week the answer came, not by post but in person, a lean, stooping, spectacled gentleman in rusty black, with a soft, dry voice and a leather case that never left his hand, who gave his name at the door as Mr. Silas Pruitt, of Gray's Inn, come down on private business to wait upon the Countess of Havering, and who was shown up, at the dowager's iron command, to her chamber alone, while Osric Wexford stood in the hall below, with his face gone from florid to a mottled apoplectic red, demanding to know what business a London attorney could have with his aunt that her own family might not hear, and getting for his answer only the closing of a door, the turn of a key, and Margaret Ashcombe standing quiet and unmovable before it, saying, in her level voice, that she was very sorry, but her mistress was not to be disturbed. The frost had come early that year, and with it a silence that settled over Havering Court like a second snowfall. The dowager's health failed by degrees, and it was the manner of the failing that grieved Margaret most. There was no single collapse, no fever that might be fought and conquered, but rather a slow ebbing, as of a tide drawing back so gradually that one scarcely marked its going until the wet sand lay bare and cold. She who had once sat bolt upright for whole afternoons, delivering her verdicts upon the follies of the age, was content by December to lie propped a little, her silver head sunk into the linen, her sharp black eyes half veiled, and yet, when they opened fully, no less sharp for all the weariness about them. "You are watching me, girl," she said one afternoon, not unkindly, catching Margaret's glance. "You needn't school your face so carefully. I have been dying by inches these 3 months, and I find I am in no great hurry to be done with it. You are stronger than you allow yourself to believe, my lady, Margaret said, though she did not truly believe it. I am nothing of the sort, and you are a poor liar, which is the best thing about you. Do not learn to lie well, Margaret. It is the ruin of a face. Cordelia lies beautifully, and see what it has done to hers. All that smiling has worn grooves in it, like a river cutting its channel. She cannot help but smile now, even when she means murder. Especially then. Margaret said nothing. She had learned that the dowager's malice, when it turned upon the Wexfords, was best met with silence. To agree was to be quoted afterward, and to demur was to be thought a fool. So she smoothed the coverlet and set another log upon the fire, and the old lady watched her with those bright, unreadable eyes. The nights were the strange time, when the house had gone quiet, and the last candle had been snuffed everywhere but in that one chamber. Lady Beatrice grew talkative in a way she never was by day, and Margaret, sitting up with her through the long hours when sleep would not come, became the keeper of things the old woman had never told to anyone. She spoke of her girlhood, of a summer at Bath, when she had been reckoned a beauty, and turned away 3 suitors for the pleasure of it. She spoke of the late Earl, her husband, with an asperity that did not quite conceal something warmer beneath. He was a dull man, and he bored me for 40 years, and I have missed him every day of the 11 since he died, which only proves there is no accounting for the heart. And she spoke, in her circling, riddling way, of the thing that lay locked and sealed in a strong box off Chancery Lane, though she never once named it. Margaret had learned not to ask. The knowledge would come, or it would not. It was not hers to reach for. There are 2 kinds of inheritance, Margaret, the dowager said one night, when the wind was worrying at the casements. There is the kind the law provides, which goes where blood sends it, whether the blood deserves it or no. And there is the other, the kind a body arranges for herself quietly, while there is yet breath to arrange it. The first is a matter of who one is born. The second, of what one has seen. She turned her head on the pillow and fixed Margaret with a look of such piercing directness that the younger woman felt it go through her like a draught. I have seen a great deal this autumn, more than anyone in this house imagines. I am not so blind nor so far gone as they would like. My lady, hush. I am not asking you to understand me. I am telling you to remember me. There is a difference, and you are clever enough to know it. She sank back as though she had laid down some heavy thing she had carried a long way. When I am gone, there will be a great noise made. I shall be sorry to miss it, for it will be the finest entertainment this dreary house has offered in a decade. You will have to enjoy it for me. Only do not flinch. Whatever is said of you, and there will be a good deal said, and none of it kind, do not flinch. A woman who does not flinch has already half won. Margaret did not know then what she was being warned of, only that she was being warned, and that the warning was given with a tenderness the old woman would never have owned to in daylight. She took the frail hand where it lay upon the coverlet, cold, the rings loose upon the wasted fingers, and held it, and the dowager let her, which was itself a kind of confession. It was of Julian Hartwell that the dowager spoke with the greatest and most surprising warmth. He is the only honest man within 20 miles, Lady Beatrice said, and honesty in a man is rarer than diamonds. My husband's people never valued him. He is only a great-nephew, and on the wrong side of the money, steward to lands he might have owned had a marriage gone otherwise 2 generations back. And do you know, he has never once spoken of it? Not a word of grievance. He does the work of 3 men, and takes the wages of 1, and touches his hat to Osric Wexford, who has not the wit to manage a hen coop, let alone an estate. She made her dry sound again. It offends me. There is a great deal about the arrangement of the world that offends me, and I have never had the power to mend above a little of it. But a little, she added, half to herself, her eyes drifting toward the fire, a little may yet be mended, if the sealing wax holds. Margaret pretended not to have heard the last of it. But it was true that she and Hartwell were thrown more together now, and it was the crisis of the old lady's health that threw them. He came often to the house on the business of the estate, for with the dowager failing there were 100 matters that could not wait, and Osric Wexford could no more be trusted to settle them than a child with a razor. But he lingered. Margaret marked that he lingered, and marked too that she was glad of it, and this last she examined with some severity in the privacy of her own room, and found she could not scold herself out of it. They fell into the habit of meeting in the library, the one warm room besides the sick chamber, where Margaret went in the evenings when the dowager slept, to read a little and gather herself before the long night's watching. Hartwell, having concluded his business with the ledgers, would come and stand a while by the fire, and they would talk, low-voiced, of the old lady, and then of other things. She discovered that he read. She had half taken him, she confessed with some shame, for a man wholly of the land and the account book, grave and useful and unfurnished within. But he knew the shelves of that library better than she did, and one evening he took down a volume of Cowper and read her a passage he was fond of, and his voice took on a quality in the reading she had not heard before, a kind of unguardedness, as though the borrowed words let him say a thing he could not have said in his own. "My father was a clergyman, like yours," he told her, closing the book but keeping it in his hands. "A younger son, with a small living, and a great many books, and no notion of how to keep sixpence in his pocket. I was raised among borrowed learning and genuine poverty. It teaches one the difference between what a thing costs and what it is worth." "My father used to say much the same," Margaret answered, though he put it that a full purse and an empty head were the commonest marriage in the parish, and the unhappiest. Hartwell smiled, a rare thing, the more to be valued for its rarity, for it changed his grave face wholly, softened the severe line of it, and made him suddenly younger. "I think that I should have liked your father." "I think," said Margaret, before she had quite decided to say it, "that he should have liked you," and then looked down at her own hands, for the fire had grown suddenly very interesting, and the silence that followed was of the kind that says more than speech, and both of them knew it, and neither disturbed it. There was a morning, clear and iron hard, the first true frost of the deep winter, when the dowager had passed a quiet night and slept late, and Mrs. Fenn shooed Margaret out of doors for the good of her color. "You are gray as the sky, miss," the housekeeper said, with the gruff kindness that was the nearest she came to affection, "and no use to her ladyship if you fall ill yourself. Go and walk. I'll sit with her the while." Margaret went, wrapped in her gray cloak, out into the walled garden, where the box hedges stood stiff and white with rime, and every leaf and twig was traced in silver, as though some patient hand had gone over the whole world in the night with a brush dipped in frost. The gravel rang under her feet, frozen hard. And there, at the turn of the yew walk, she came upon Julian Hartwell, sent out by the same Mrs. Fenn on the same errand, looking at the frozen fountain, his dark coat very stark against all that whiteness. He turned at the sound of her step, and something in his face, a gladness he did not trouble to hide, made her own heart give a small unruly leap that she deplored and could not govern. "I did not think to find anyone abroad so early," he said. "Mrs. Fenn, I collect, has been managing us both." "She is a great manager," Margaret agreed. "I believe she thinks us neither of us fit to be trusted with our own health. She may be right." He fell into step beside her, and they walked the length of the frozen walk together, slowly, their breath mingling in the still air. The garden lay all about them, transfigured and silent, the fountain locked in its own ice, the sundial capped with frost so that it could tell no hour, and it seemed to Margaret that they had stepped outside of time into some hushed white country where the troubles of the house could not follow. "She is failing," Hartwell said at last, quietly, and there was no need to say who. "You know it better than any of us. You are with her in the nights." "I know it." Margaret's voice was steady, though the knowledge sat heavy. "She speaks of it herself, without fear. I think she has made her peace with the dying at least. There are other things she has not." No, he was silent a moment. "She has a great deal on her conscience that is not hers to bear, the doings of the whole family for 40 years, that she watched and could not prevent." He glanced sidelong at her. "You have been a great comfort to her, Miss Ashcombe. I do not think you know how much. She is gentler since you came. Not to the world, never to the world, but underneath. You have reached something in her that the rest of us gave up as unreachable years ago." The praise, so plainly and gravely given, brought a warmth to Margaret's cold cheeks that owed nothing to the exercise. "I have done very little. I have only listened. It is astonishing how much people will forgive you, if only you will listen without wanting anything of them." "Is that your art, then? Wanting nothing?" She considered the question longer than perhaps it required, for it had gone deeper than he meant. "I have not been in a position to want much," she said finally and simply. "A dowerless woman learns early to keep her wants small. They are more portable so." She looked out over the white garden. "One learns to take pleasure in the thing itself, and not in the having of it. In a book without needing to own it. In a morning like this, without needing it to last." She caught herself, wary of having said too much. "It has served me." Hartwell had stopped walking. She stopped too, and found him looking at her with an expression she could not read, and did not dare to interpret, though her heart was doing so with a reckless swiftness quite beyond her authority to check. "And yet," he said, "lo, there may come things a person ought to allow herself to want. That it would be a kind of cowardice not to want." He seemed on the verge of saying more. She saw the words gather in him, saw the grave face working with the effort of some resolve, and the whole frozen garden seemed to hold its breath with her. But the words did not come. Some scruple caught them back, the impropriety of it, with the old woman dying not 50 yards away, or only the deep native reserve of the man, which could open the smallest crack and then must close it again. He drew a breath and turned it aside. "Forgive me, I speak out of turn. It is not the season for it, nor the place." And he offered her his arm to walk back, the moment folded away as neatly as a letter into its envelope, and yet not lost, she thought, taking his arm and feeling the warmth of it through the cold cloth, only kept, only set aside for a better hour, if a better hour should come. They did not see the pale gold head at the upstairs window. Cordelia Wexford had drawn back the curtain to judge the weather, and had seen instead the two figures at the turn of the yew-walk, the slowness of their pacing, the closeness of them, the whole unmistakable geometry of two people who had forgotten, for the length of a garden walk, that anyone might be watching. She stood very still behind the glass, her jeweled fingers tightening on the curtain, and the false practiced smile faded slowly from her face, leaving something colder and far more attentive in its place. She had thought the companion beneath her notice, a gray little nobody to be swept out with the rest of the old woman's leavings the moment the will was read. But there was Julian Hartwell, who bowed to no one and warmed to nothing. bending his dark grave head toward her as though she were the only thing worth looking at in all that wide white morning. And Cordelia, who understood advantage as some people understand music, felt the first cold prick of a suspicion that would not afterward be soothed away. "Now what?" she murmured to the empty room, watching them come back along the silvered walk. "Are you about, you sly little mouse?" And she let the curtain fall, while below her the two figures parted at the garden door with a courtesy that told her precisely everything they were most anxious to conceal. The stillness in the room had changed its texture. For hours Margaret had sat in the low chair beside the great bed, listening to the slow, labored tide of the old woman's breathing rise and fall through the small hours. The single candle had burned down to a stub, the fire had settled into a bed of dull red coals, and the night had gone very quiet, as though the whole great house were holding its breath along with the woman in the bed. Earlier Lady Beatrice had been fretful, plucking at the coverlet, complaining that the pillows were badly set, and that Margaret fussed like a hen. And Margaret had borne it all with the same unhurried gentleness, setting the pillows, smoothing the lace of the black cap that even now the old lady would not be without, moistening the cracked lips with a little water. But the fretfulness had ebbed as the clock crept past 2, and a strange peace had come over the sharp, imperious face, softening it in a way Margaret had never seen. Once, near 3, the black eyes had opened and found her in the candlelight, perfectly clear, perfectly knowing, the old formidable intelligence looking out without malice and without pretense. "You are still here," the dowager had murmured. "It was not quite a question. I am here, my lady. I shall not go." The thin mouth had moved, and Margaret had bent low to catch the words. "Foolish girl, you should have run off with the others, long ago." But there was no venom in it now. There was something almost like tenderness, buried very deep, as a stone is buried in a field, showing only its worn gray edge. The old hand had turned beneath Margaret's, the papery fingers closing with surprising force. "You have been," Lady Beatrice said, spacing the words with great effort, "a great deal too good to a wicked old woman." "You have not been wicked to me, my lady," Margaret said softly, and found that her eyes had filled. "Have I not?" The ghost of the old dry humor. "Then I have grown careless." The fingers tightened once more. "Julian," she said then, as if beginning some further thought, only the one word, the great-nephew's name, spoken with a weight Margaret did not then understand. And then the effort seemed to leave her, and the black eyes drifted closed again, and she said no more. After that the breathing grew slower and further apart and shallower, until Margaret, holding herself very still, found that she was counting the long silences between one breath and the next, and dreading each time that the next would not come. And at last, somewhere in the grayest hour before the dawn, when the candle guttered and the coals had sunk to ash, it did not come. There was no struggle, no last sharp word, nothing but a small settling, a loosening, as of a traveler at last laying down a burden carried very far. The imperious face upon the pillow went smooth and remote and still. The silver-headed cane stood propped against the bedpost, and its owner had gone quietly out from under all its authority, out past the reach of the estate and the fortune and the grasping heirs, out where none of them could follow to trouble her. Margaret sat a long while without moving. She did not weep, not yet. She only held the cooling hand and looked at the still face, and something in her own breast felt hollowed out and swept clean, the way a church feels after the congregation has gone and only the cold light remains. She had come to Havering Court a stranger, hired for wages. warned by every servant that the old countess would break her as she had broken all the rest. And now she sat alone in the dark with her, the only soul who had been at her side, and she found, to her own faint astonishment, that she grieved. Not for a position lost, though she knew her place in the world had died along with the woman in the bed. She grieved for the person, for the sharp black eyes and the cutting tongue that had so slowly come to trust her, for the loneliness she had glimpsed beneath all that armor, for the fact that at the very end, when it mattered, Lady Beatrice had chosen to have her, plain, dowerless Margaret Ashcombe, the vicar's orphan, and no other, in the room. It was Mrs. Fenn she went to first, when at last she rose on stiff limbs and drew the sheet gently up. She found the housekeeper already stirring in the grey passage below, roused by that instinct old servants keep, and at the look on Margaret's face the stout woman's tight mouth trembled and pressed hard together. "So, Mrs. Fenn said, very low, it's come." And then, unexpectedly, she gripped Margaret's arm hard for a moment, the nearest thing to an embrace that so rigid a woman could permit herself. "You stayed with her to the end. That's more than her own blood would have done." It was, Margaret would think afterwards, the last wholly kind thing anyone at Havering Court would say to her for a long while. The house woke, and the machinery of death set itself in motion. Word was sent by the first light to the rectory, and to the physician, and, because it must be, to Mr. Osric Wexford at the inn in the market town, where he and his wife had taken to lodging these several weeks, hovering near the estate like crows above a failing beast. They came within the hour, before the body was even properly laid out, and Margaret saw at once that whatever grief was in that house had not come with them. Osric's florid face wore a careful arrangement of solemnity that could not quite hide the bright, hungry satisfaction beneath it. His eyes moved over the paneling and the good old furniture with the frank assessment of a man taking inventory of what is already his. Cordelia came at his side in exquisite mourning she could not conceivably have had made in a single morning. So it had been ordered and ready, waiting these many days, her jeweled smile put decently away, though the hard glitter of her eyes was not so easily hidden. "Where is she?" Osric demanded of Mrs. Fenn, not troubling to lower his voice. And then, scarcely pausing, "The London men are written to? Pruitt and the rest?" "The will must be read directly the funeral's done. The estate cannot be left to drift." The funeral was a cold, correct, well-attended affair. For the Countess of Havering could not be buried without a proper show. The county came in its carriages, and the tenants stood bareheaded in the churchyard slush, and Margaret stood a little apart in her grey half-mourning. She had no black, and could not afford to buy it, feeling herself already half a ghost, a thing left over from a household that had ceased to exist. Only once did she feel herself seen. Across the open grave, Julian Hartwell's grave dark eyes found hers, and held them a moment, steady and not unkind, before propriety drew them both away. It was, in those grey days, nearly the only warmth that reached her. The reading of the will was set for the second morning after the burial, in the library. Mr. Silas Pruitt had come down from London the evening before, small and spare and spectacled in rusty black, precise and unhurried, with a leather case of papers that he guarded upon his knee as though it held something alive. Margaret had been told, coldly, by way of a footman, that she was to attend. She supposed there might be some trifling remembrance, and she dreaded even that, dreaded sitting among these people to be looked at and weighed. She took a chair near the door, where the servants sat, and folded her hands, and made herself small and still. The library was very full and very cold. Osric took the great chair by the hearth as though it had been made for him. Cordelia beside him with her gloved hands folded and her chin lifted. Mrs. Fenn and the upper servants sat stiffly along the wall. Julian Hartwell stood near one of the tall windows, a little apart, his face unreadable. And Mr. Pruitt, having settled his spectacles and arranged his papers with maddening deliberation, began. Margaret understood very little of the long, dry preamble, but she understood the substance well enough as it emerged, for it was precisely what everyone in the county had always assumed. The bulk of the great fortune, the funded money, the plate, the London holdings, the whole weight of the Havering wealth, save what was strictly entailed elsewhere, passed, under this known and long-standing will, to the dowager's nephew and nearest surviving kinsman, Mr. Osric Wexford, and Havering Court with it. There were bequests to old servants, small and correct, a sum to Mrs. Fenn, a mourning ring, an annuity, read out while Osric drummed his fingers with poorly hidden impatience. Margaret's own name, when it came, brought her a small, sharp jolt, a sum of £10, to my companion, Miss Margaret Ashcombe, in acknowledgment of her attendance. £10. It was said, and Pruitt read on, and it was over. She sat very still and felt the color come up in her face, not for the smallness of it, but because she felt every eye in the room flick toward her and away, appraising. And she saw Cordelia's mouth curve in the faintest, most delicate of smiles. When Pruitt had done and squared his papers, Osric rose. He did not wait for the solicitor to gather his things. He rose in the flush of his triumph, master now of Havering Court, and his glance swept the room and came to rest, of all places, upon Margaret in her chair by the door. And whatever satisfaction the great inheritance had put into his florid face, it seemed to require, to be complete, this one small further act. "Well," he said, and his voice filled the cold room. "That is settled then, and none too soon. There remains only the matter of tidying the household. Mrs. Fenn, we shall speak this afternoon of the arrangements going forward. You need not fear for your place, provided you suit." Then he turned again to Margaret, and his tone hardened, took on the flat dismissiveness he might have used to a tradesman lingering too long in his hall. "As for you, Miss Ashcombe, your service to my aunt is at an end, as of course you understand. I'll not be ungenerous. You shall have a fortnight's wage in hand, over and above the £10 my aunt saw fit to leave you, and a place on the carrier's cart to the town when you've packed your box. I'll want your room by tomorrow noon. There's no cause to prolong it." The words fell into a complete silence. Margaret rose from her chair, because she would not be spoken to sitting, and stood very straight in her gray gown with her hands folded. And though her heart was beating hard, she kept her chin level and her voice quiet. "You are very good, sir. I shall be gone by noon tomorrow." She would give him nothing else. No plea, no tremor, no satisfaction of seeing her flinch. But Cordelia was not content to let it end so cleanly. She turned in her chair, the black silk whispering, and let her cold, glittering gaze travel up and down Margaret's plain figure with open, leisurely contempt. "One does wonder," she said, to the room at large, in a light, carrying voice, what a young woman of no family and no fortune imagined she might get, playing nurse to a rich old woman all these months. £10 seems a very fair wage for it. Some in your position might have hoped for a good deal more, might have worked rather hard to be remembered, if you take my meaning. But then my aunt was nobody's fool, whatever else she was. The smile she gave was exquisite and false and cut like a blade. £10. Yes, that tells its own tale, does it not? The insult was perfectly aimed, and Margaret felt it strike. The imputation that she had schemed, had toadied, had hung about a dying woman's bed in hope of legacies, and had been justly put in her place with a beggar's 10 pounds. Several of the county mourners who yet lingered turned their faces away in that particular way that is worse than open staring. Mrs. Fenn's mouth went white and thin, but a housekeeper who wished to keep her place said nothing. Margaret stood in the center of all those eyes and felt the heat of the shame that was not hers rise in her cheeks, and thought, with a strange cold clarity, that she had never been so entirely alone. She did not defend herself. There was no defense that would not sound like exactly the pleading they wished to see, and she had too much of her father's plain, stubborn dignity to grovel before people who had already decided what she was. "I nursed your aunt, madam," she said at last, very quietly, "because it was my place, and because in the end I was fond of her. I asked her for nothing, living or dead, and I take nothing from this house but what she freely chose to give me, and my own box, and the clothes I stand in. Good morning." And she inclined her head to Cordelia, to Osric, with a composure that cost her more than they would ever know, and turned, and walked out of the cold library with her back straight and her step unhurried, and did not let herself hasten until the door was shut behind her. Only there, in the empty corridor with its old dark portraits looking down, did she let herself stop and press one hand flat against the cold wall and stand a moment with her eyes shut, breathing. She would not weep in that house. She had a box to pack, and a morning to get through, and beyond tomorrow noon, a whole vast uncertain nothing. No situation, no letter of character worth the name from such a master, no family to take her in, 10 pounds and a fortnight's wage between herself and the world. There was, quite literally, nowhere she was expected. She had known, by the deathbed, that her place had died with the old woman. She had not, until this cold, bright morning, felt the whole weight of it settle onto her shoulders. She was still standing, so when she heard a measured step come round the turn of the passage and stop, it was Julian Hartwell, halted a little way off, his hat in his hand, plainly unwilling either to intrude upon her or to pass her by as though he had seen nothing. His grave dark eyes went over her face, the pallor of it, the effort of the held composure, and something moved behind his own, some quiet anger that was not directed at her, and a gentleness he did not seem to know quite how to offer. "Miss Ashcombe," he said. His voice was low, pitched not to carry. "I must beg your pardon for what you were made to hear in that room. It was worse than ungently done. It was unjust, and everyone with sense enough to see knew it for what it was." He turned the hat once in his hands, a small betraying gesture in so composed a man. "My great-aunt's people are what they are. You must not let it make you doubt yourself, for there is not a servant in this house, nor an honest soul in this county, who does not know how you cared for her when they would not come near her." Margaret found her voice, though it was not quite steady. "You are kind to say so, Mrs. Hartwell. I am afraid kindness is a thing I am not very well armored against, just at present." A small, unwilling, wavering smile touched her mouth and was gone. "I have managed the unkindness rather better." That drew from him the faintest answering warmth, quickly sobered. "Where will you go, tomorrow when you leave? Have you people somewhere to be received?" She might have lied to spare them both the awkwardness of the truth. But she was too tired, and he had asked too plainly. "No," she said simply. "My father is a year dead, and the living is another man's now. I have no near people living. I shall take a room at the inn while I can pay for it, and write to the registry offices for a situation, a governess, or a companion again, if any lady will have me on no character but my own word." She lifted her chin. "I have been poor before, sir. I shall contrive." He was silent a moment, and she saw that her answer had not eased him, but deepened the quiet trouble in his look. "You should not be turned out onto a carrier's cart into the winter with nowhere to go," he said low, "for the crime of having been decent to a dying woman. It is not to be borne." Then, seeming to recollect himself, he drew back a step and inclined his head with a plain, honest courtesy that had nothing in it of Osric's condescension. "Forgive me. I have no right to arrange your affairs, but I would ask you not to leave in the morning without letting me know that you are safely settled. There are those who would not sleep easy otherwise." He paused, and added, more quietly still, "And there is a matter. I can say nothing of it now. It is not mine to say. But I would ask you not to give up your case for lost quite so entirely as those people in that room would have you do. Things are not always so plain as they are read out of a will." She looked at him then, puzzled, searching his grave face for his meaning, but he had already said more than he was easy with. He only bowed once, and set his hat upon his head, and went, and Margaret stood alone again in the cold passage beneath the dark old portraits, turning his strange words over and over, while the winter light thinned toward afternoon, and the long day of her leaving drew on. But she did not leave, for before noon the next morning word came, by Pruitt's own hand, that she was to remain, and that a further reading was set for the following day, in the long drawing-room, and that her presence was required. She sat where Mrs. Fenn had placed her, a little apart on the hard chair beside the tall window, her hands folded, her back straight, and she waited. Mr. Pruitt came into the long drawing-room at 11:15, without hurry. He had travelled up from London on the night mail and slept. By his own account, not at all. Yet there was nothing of the traveller's disorder about him. His spectacles were polished. His small leather case held before him in both hands as a churchwarden might hold the collection plate. He crossed to the great table beneath the Havering arms and set his case upon it, and only then let his mild, magnified eyes travel once around the assembled company. They were all there. Osric Wexford stood before the cold hearth with his thumbs in his waistcoat, florid and swelling, the very picture of a man who has already spent an inheritance in his mind and come to hear the figures confirmed. Cordelia sat near him on the small gilt sofa, exquisite in dove-gray silk that was mourning and yet somehow was not, her jeweled hand resting light upon the sofa's arm, her smile fixed in place like a thing pinned to a board. Julian Hartwell stood apart by the far window, dark and grave and very still. And Margaret, in her gray half-mourning, sat in the corner where a paid companion sits when the family gathers, present because she had been summoned and not because anyone thought she belonged. "I am obliged to you all for your patience," said Mr. Pruitt. He drew out the chair at the head of the table and did not sit in it, but stood behind it, resting his fingertips upon its back. "I have this morning to lay before you the final testamentary dispositions of the late Countess. You have already heard the will of the year 9, which Mr. Grimble read to you upon the day of the funeral, and which is, I do not dispute, a valid instrument, duly executed and witnessed. I have no quarrel with a word of it." Osric made a small sound of satisfaction and rocked back upon his heels. "But," said Mr. Pruitt, and the single small word fell into the room like a stone into a still pool, "it is not the last word the Countess had to say upon the matter." The rocking stopped. In the spring of this present year the solicitor went on, unhurried, drawing a key upon a black ribbon from his waistcoat and fitting it to the lock of his case. "Her ladyship sent for me. Not for Mr. Grimble, whom she esteemed, but for me, whose name she had of her late husband's man of business, and whom she required for the particular reason that I was unknown in this county and had no connection with any person now in this room. The lock gave with a small, clean click. She instructed me to draw a codicil to her will, in her own words, of a sound and disposing mind. I would take my oath upon it before any court in the kingdom, and I may yet be called to do so. She read it over twice. She executed it in my presence and in the presence of 2 witnesses, neither a beneficiary, neither a servant of this house who might be thought subject to influence. He lifted from the case a folded parchment, heavy seals hanging from it upon their tapes of ribbon, and laid it flat upon the table and smoothed it with the side of his hand. It has lain in my strong room in Lincoln's Inn from that day to this. No living soul but her ladyship, the 2 witnesses, and myself has known of its existence. I will now read it to you. This is monstrous. Osric had come off his heels and forward a stride, his face gone from red to a deeper, uglier color. A secret paper sprung upon us. My aunt was ill, sir. She was old. She was not always in command of her, your aunt, said Mr. Pruitt without heat, was in the spring of this year as much in command of her faculties as I am of mine, and a good deal more, I should say, than several persons I have had occasion to observe this morning. You are at perfect liberty, Misty Wexford, to contest the instrument in the proper place, at your own charge. I should advise you to weigh well the cost of doing so against the likelihood of success. But that is a matter for another day. This morning I read. He settled his spectacles. You may sit, sir, or you may stand. But I will ask you to let me read without interruption, as her ladyship would have wished. There was a silence. Osric did not sit. But he did not speak again, and after a moment Mr. Pruitt lowered his eyes to the parchment and began, in the flat, clear, carrying voice of a man long practiced in reading aloud what other men would rather not hear. I, Beatrice Wexford, Dowager Countess of Havering, being of sound mind and whole memory, and mindful that the settlement of my earthly affairs as it presently stands does not answer to my true wishes nor to the deserts of those about me, do make this codicil to my last will and testament, to be taken as part thereof, and to overrule such of the provisions of the said will as are hereinafter varied, all else to stand. He paused, and turned the parchment a little to the light. First, whereas by my said will the residue of my personal estate falls to my nephew Osric Wexford, I do now revoke the bequest to him of the sum of £8,000 therein named, and reduce the same to the sum of £2,000, the difference to be applied as hereinafter directed. The sound that came from Cordelia was very small, no more than a sharp indrawn breath through the nose, but in that stillness it carried, and Julian Hartwell's grave eyes moved, for the first time from the middle distance to her face. Second, Mr. Pruitt read on, I have had these many months in my house a young gentlewoman, Margaret Ashcombe, daughter of the late Reverend Josiah Ashcombe, sometime vicar of the parish of Nethercumba, who came to me as a paid companion and who has given me. Here something in the room seemed to lean in toward the words, who has given me, in the last year of my life, a truer and more disinterested service than I have had of my own blood. She has neither flattered me nor feared me. She has done her duty when there was no advantage in the doing and no witness to it. I am not deceived. I know the difference between those who wait upon my comfort and those who wait upon my death. Osric's color was frightful now. Cordelia sat very still, her jeweled hand closed upon the sofa's arm, the knuckles standing white through the fine skin. To the said Margaret Ashcombe, therefore, I give and bequeath the sum of £600 in the 4%, to be settled upon her, and to her sole and separate use, free of the control of any husband she may hereafter take, that she may have bread of her own and bow to no one for it. And further, I give and devise to her the use and enjoyment, for the term of her natural life, of the dwelling known as the Dower House at Havering, with its gardens and appurtenances, and the yearly sum of £100 for the maintenance thereof, she keeping it in good repair, and upon her death the said house to revert to the estate. This I do, being of clear mind and my own free will, that a good woman may not be turned out of doors into the world with nothing when I am gone, as I might have been turned out in my own youth, had Providence not been kinder to me than my kin were minded to be. Margaret had not moved. She sat in the corner with her hands folded and her face very white and very still, aware, distantly, that her name had been spoken in a dead woman's voice, and that the room had turned, all of it, to look at her. She did not look back at any of them. She looked at the folded hands in her gray lap and thought of the old lady's fingers closing over hers in the last week and saying nothing at all, only holding. And she understood now what the holding had meant, and her eyes stung, and she would not. Before these people, let a single tear fall. There is more, said Mr. Pruitt. He turned the parchment. Third, it has long been upon my conscience that the holding known as Longmere and the Hartwell farms lying to the east of the park, which came to my late husband's family in his great-uncle's time, and which by every right of blood and long service ought to have descended to his great-nephew Julian Hartwell, were by an oversight of the old settlement tied to the main estate and withheld from him, he being left to serve as steward upon land that his own labor has bettered these 10 years and more, and to take wages where he should have taken his own. Julian Hartwell had gone very still by the window. The grave composure of his face did not break, but a muscle moved once in his jaw, and his clasped hands tightened until the knuckles whitened, and he kept his eyes fixed upon the far wall as a man does who is determined that his face shall betray nothing and is not entirely certain it will obey him. I cannot give him back the years, Mr. Pruitt Reed, but I may give him the land. I therefore give and devise to the said Julian Hartwell, his heirs and assigns forever, the farms of Longmere and Hartwell aforesaid, with all their lands, buildings, timber, and rights of way, to hold as his own absolutely and freed of the estate, that he may at last be master where he has too long been servant. He has asked me for nothing. It is the surest sign that a man may safely be given much. No. Cordelia was on her feet. The word came out not loud but shaking, and all the brittle jeweled elegance of her had cracked clean across like ice over deep water, and what showed through was raw and pale and furious. This is, you cannot mean us to sit here and swallow it, a scribbled paper got out of a sick old woman by a paid drab and a bailiff who fawned at her chair. Do you take us for fools? Osric, will you stand there? Will you say nothing? Cordelia, Osric's voice was thick. He put out a hand toward her. Whether to soothe or silence her, not even he perhaps could have said. Cordelia, be quiet. I will not be quiet. She rounded on him, and then on Mr. Pruitt, and then, worst of all, upon Margaret in her corner, her lovely face distorted now past all its careful arrangement, 2 spots of color burning high upon the pale cheeks. Look at her sitting there, so meek, so gray, so good. Oh, she has played it beautifully, months of it, fetching the shawl and reading the sermons and holding the withered old hand, and all of it for this, for the house and the money and the land for her lover into the bargain. For I'll not believe the 2 of them were not hand in glove, a companion and a steward, the pair of them creeping. Madam, Julian Hartwell's voice cut across the room, low and hard and level, and it stopped her as her husband's had not. He had turned from the window at last. He was not loud, but there was a weight in the two syllables that brought the whole room up short. And he looked at Cordelia Wexford across the length of the drawing-room with a still cold steadiness that was worse than any shouting. "You will say what you please of me. I have broad enough shoulders and have heard worse in a farmyard. But you will not, while I stand in the room, say one word more against Miss Ashcombe. She has earned every farthing of what that paper gives her. And if you knew the half of what she bore in silence in this house from a dying woman's temper, and from yours, madam, you would hold your tongue for shame, if shame were a thing you kept about you." The silence after that was dreadful. Cordelia stood trembling, her hand pressed to her breast, and something crossed her face. Not shame, Margaret thought, watching from her corner, but the shock of a woman who has for the first time in a long while been spoken to as no one had dared speak to her. Mr. Pruitt cleared his throat, and the small dry sound recalled them all to the folded, sealed, unarguable fact that lay upon the table beneath the Havering arms. "I will finish, if I may. There is little more, and then I shall leave you." He looked over the tops of his spectacles at Osric Wexford with something that was not unkind and not in the least uncertain. "I would only put you in mind, sir, before you commit yourself and your lady to a course that will be long and public and dear, of the character of the instrument I hold. It is regular. It is witnessed. It was drawn by a solicitor of 30 years' standing, who has since set down, under his own hand, the whole manner and circumstance of its making, against just such a challenge as I see forming in this room. Her ladyship foresaw you both. She told me precisely what would be said in this room upon this morning, and by whom, and instructed me how I should answer it." He allowed himself the very faintest dry ghost of a smile. "I find her prediction has wanted nothing of the event." He gathered the parchment, unhurried, and folded it along its old creases, and restored it to the leather case and turned the little key upon it, and the whole small competent finality of the movements said more plainly than any argument that the thing was done and would not be undone by wishing. Margaret rose. She scarcely knew that she meant to until she was upon her feet, and the eyes of the room came to her, and she felt the blood beat in her throat, but she stood straight in her gray gown, and when she spoke her voice did not shake. "Mr. Pruitt, I did not know. I want it said, before them all, that until this morning I did not know one word of this. She never told me. I never asked her for anything, nor looked for anything, nor," her voice caught, once, upon the edge of the old woman's memory, and she mastered it, "nor served her for anything but that she was alone, and old, and had no one, and I would not have had her die with no one. That is all. Whatever that paper says of me, I would have you know I did not buy it." "Child," said Mr. Pruitt gently, and it was the first warmth he had let into his voice in the whole of that cold morning, "I know it. So did she. It is written on the face of the thing for those with eyes to read it. That is precisely why you have it." And he inclined his head to her, a small, grave, courteous bow such as he might have made to any lady of the house, and not at all such as a man of business makes to a servant in the corner. And Osric saw it, and Cordelia saw it, and the meaning of it, that the world, beginning with this careful London stranger, had already commenced to reckon Margaret Ashcombe among the people who mattered, was not lost upon a soul in that room. Cordelia turned, with a sound like a sob strangled at its birth, and went from the room, her gray silk hissing over the floor, and Osric, after one look about him, at the shut leather case, at the steward, who was a landowner now, at the gray companion who was a gentlewoman of independent means, went heavily after his wife without a word. His tread upon the stair, the tread of a man walking away from something he has not yet understood, he has lost. She could not have said, afterward, which she found harder to bear, the open contempt or the smiling kind. The open contempt came first. Osric Wexford arrived not 3 days after the reading of the Codicil, in a hired chaise and a temper, and did not wait to be announced. Margaret heard him from the small parlor where she sat with her mending, the door flung back, the wet slap of his boots, his voice thick and carrying, demanding to know where she was. Margaret set aside her work. She had learned that there was a particular strength in stillness, and she gathered it about her now. When Osric burst into the parlor, florid and streaming, she rose and made him a small correct curtsy, and the very quietness of it seemed to enrage him further. "You needn't play the lady with me," he said. "I know what you are. A month, was it? 6 weeks before you had your claws in? Before you sat by that bed and whispered your little poisons in a dying woman's ear until she scarcely knew her own mind?" "Your aunt," said Margaret, "knew her own mind to the last hour I saw her. Her mind." He laughed, an ugly sound. "She was 80 years old and rotten with pain. You will not tell me that woman, who had promised me and Cordelia these 5 years and more, sat down of her own free reason and gave a dower house and 300 a year to a hired nobody, a parson's brat with dust on her hem, unless somebody had worked upon her. You will not tell me that, girl, and expect me to swallow it." There was nothing to be gained by answering. A man in Osric's condition did not want an answer. He wanted a target, and every word she offered him was only another surface to bruise his fist upon. So she stood, and looked at him with her calm gray eyes, until, precisely because she would not flinch, he ran himself out of breath. "There is a solicitor," she said, when he had done. "Mr. Pruitt of Gray's Inn. Anything you wish to say concerning the will, you would do better to say to him." "Oh, I shall say it to him, and to every court in the land. And you may depend upon this, that before I am finished, there will not be a drawing-room in 3 counties that does not know the manner of woman who calls herself Miss Ashcombe. We shall see how you like your independence then, madam, when you have it and nothing else, no name, no place, no friend to sit at your table." It was Cordelia, arriving a quarter of an hour behind her husband with her temper better hid, who understood the true shape of the threat and gave it edge. She came into the parlor on a rustle of dove-gray silk, took one look at her husband, purple and panting by the cold hearth, and one look at Margaret, and she smiled. "Osric, you are making a spectacle. Do go and find Fen and have her bring us some Madeira, shouting never mended anything." And when he had gone, grumbling, glad in truth to be given an errand, she turned that smile upon Margaret and let it soften into something that might have passed for sympathy. "You must forgive him," she said. "He is very grieved." She drew off her gloves, finger by finger, and seated herself uninvited in the good chair by the window. "And of course it is a shock. My husband had every reasonable expectation, and to find at the last that his aunt had been persuaded, shall we say, into some other course, by a person so lately come among us, well, you see how it must look. Miss Ashcombe, you are not a stupid young woman. I see how you intend to make it look," said Margaret. Cordelia's smile did not waver, but something behind it cooled and hardened, like sugar water setting to glass. "That is very frank. Then I shall be frank in return. You have no fortune and no family to speak of, and nothing in the world but the good opinion of those who know you. That is all you have. Your good name. and I would have you consider very carefully, in the quiet of the night, how little it would take to spend it. A word here, a raised eyebrow there, a story told at the right table, in the right disbelieving tone. It is astonishing, she said, drawing on her gloves again, how quickly a young woman's reputation can be made to look like something quite other than it is, and how very difficult it is, once spent, to buy back at any price. She rose, genuinely beautiful in that moment, nothing in her face but pleasant regret. "Give it up," she said gently. "The house, the money, sign it over. Take some small thing for your trouble, £100, we should not be ungenerous, and go quietly, and we shall none of us ever speak of you again except with kindness. Fight us, and I promise you, you will win nothing but the ruin of the one thing you own. Think on it." And she went out, on the same soft rustle of silk, and left Margaret standing alone in the cold parlor, with her heart beating hard against her stays and her hands, for the first time not quite steady. The slander began within the week, and it moved faster than any honest word could follow. Margaret marked its progress by small things. By the way, the vicar's wife at Nether Havering, cordial enough at the funeral, was suddenly always just leaving as Margaret arrived. By the letter of condolence from an old friend of her father's that did not come. By the servants' faces in the village, which turned a degree too carefully away. She heard, through Mrs. Fenn, the particular tale that was being told, that the companion had wormed her way into the dowager's confidence by flattery and physic, had kept the old lady from her rightful family, had perhaps, this was the newest embroidery, and the ugliest hastened matters at the end, with a heavier hand on the laudanum bottle than a nurse should have. There was no shred of proof of any of it. A whisper wants no proof. It wants only a willing ear. And the neighborhood, which had never quite known what to make of the vicar's dowerless daughter, raised so suddenly above her station, had willing ears in plenty. Margaret bore it as one bears weather, or grief, or any other thing that cannot be argued with and must simply be lived through. She did not weep where any soul could see. She kept to the court and to her small round of duties, because idleness would have been worse. She wrote her letters and read her father's sermons and walked in the wet park in the failing afternoons, straight-backed. And if her face was pale, it was not a face that any watcher could have called ashamed. She had done nothing, and she would not behave as though she had, and she would not give Cordelia Wexford the satisfaction of seeing one stone of her displaced. But it cost her. There were nights she lay awake and felt the slander close around the house like a fog, and thought that perhaps Cordelia was right after all, that a good name once smirched was smirched for good, and that she might win her 300 a year and her dower house, and sit in them quite alone for the rest of her life, an object of suspicion at every gathering she was too proud to attend, and that this would be a kind of winning any sensible woman would call defeat. It was Julian Hartwell who found her in the yew walk on such an afternoon 3 weeks into the siege, and it was the first time since the funeral that they had spoken more than the barest civilities. He had kept his distance, and she had understood why, and honored him for it, for a word too warm from him. In that season would have been another log on the fire the Wexfords were building beneath her. Already there were those who hinted that the steward and the companion had reached some understanding, 2 ambitious servants dividing the spoils. So he had held off, at the cost she now saw written in his own face, drawn and tired and older than his 30-odd years. But this afternoon he came down the yew walk toward her with the wet gravel loud under his boots, and did not turn aside. "Miss Ashcombe," He stopped a proper distance from her and took off his hat, and the rain silvered his dark hair at once. "Forgive me. I have wanted this fortnight to speak to you, and have not dared, and I find I can no longer help it. I could not watch you walk here alone another day and say nothing. You do me no service by being seen, Miss Hartwell," she said, though her voice was not steady on his name. "You know what they say. I know precisely what they say. They say it of me as loudly as of you, and I care nothing for what they say of me, and cannot bear what they say of you. That is the whole of it." He looked at her, grave and direct, the rain running down his collar. "I knew her, Miss Ashcombe, better than that fool of a nephew ever troubled to. 26 years, from a boy. That woman was never in her life persuaded to a single thing she did not wish to do. Not by me, not by her husband while he lived, not by God Almighty. She was the most wholly ungovernable creature I ever met, and she died as she lived, with every wit about her, and sharper than any of us. The notion that a gentle girl of 25 led her by the nose to her own will, he stopped, and mastered himself. It is a slander on her as much as on you, and I will not stand by and see the pair of you labelled together and hold my tongue for the sake of my own good name. My good name may go hang. Something in Margaret that had been held rigid for 3 weeks bent, all at once, and very nearly broke. She turned her face away toward the dripping yews and pressed her lips together hard, and it was a moment before she could trust herself. "I have been so alone in it," she said at last, very low. "I did not know how alone until this minute. You are not alone in it. That is the thing I came to say. Pruitt is coming down from London on Thursday, and he does not come empty-handed. Have you heard nothing?" She shook her head. She had had a brief, dry note from Mr. Pruitt. "Pray be patient, Miss Ashcombe. Do nothing, sign nothing, and leave the Wexford's noise to me, and nothing since. Then hear it now, and sleep the better for it." And there, in the streaming yew walk, Julian Hartwell told her what the little spectacled solicitor had been about while she sat bearing her weather in silence. For Silas Pruitt had not been idle a single day. Beneath his dry, dusty manner, he was a man who had grown old in the wars of contested wills, and he had smelled Osric Wexford coming the way an old campaigner smells powder on the wind. From the first he had done the one thing that wins such fights before they are fought. He had assembled his proofs. There was, first, the codicil itself, not scrawled in a shaking hand upon a deathbed, as the village would have it, but drawn up 4 months before the dowager's death, in the fair firm copperplate of her own writing, witnessed and sealed in Pruitt's chambers on a day when she had come up to town expressly for the purpose, and had, by the testimony of everyone who saw her, been at the very top of her acid form. Pruitt had those witnesses, respectable men of law, ready to swear to her clearness of mind. There was second, the physician, old Dr. Cathcart, who had attended the dowager these 15 years, prepared to state upon his oath that his patient had been, to the very end, entirely compos mentis, and as fit to make a will as any woman in England, and who took a personal affront at the suggestion that anyone had meddled with her medicines, since he himself had regulated every drop. And there was, best of all, the dowager herself, Julian said, and for the first time something almost like a smile touched his grave mouth. She wrote letters. You know she did. You carried half of them to the post yourself. She wrote to her cousin in Bath, and to her old friend Lady Marchmont, and to Pruitt, plain and merciless and entirely herself. And in 3 of them, Pruitt has them. She sets down in her own hand exactly what she meant to do, and why, and what she thought of the nephew who was so certain of her money. She writes that she means to provide for the one person under that roof who had never once tried to flatter her nor angle for a shilling, and had borne her temper with more patience than it deserved, and that she would sooner leave her money to a girl who had earned it by kindness than to a Wexford who thought it owed him by blood. She names you. She gives her reasons, and she dates it, months before she died, when no living soul could pretend she was failing. Margaret stood very still. The rain had soaked through the shoulders of her gray pelisse, and she did not feel it. She wrote that. Pruitt says, and Pruitt is not a man given to raising hopes, that when those letters are laid before the court beside the Codicil, and Cathcart has had his say, and the clerks from Gray's Inn have sworn to the state of her that day, there will be no case left standing to argue. The only question is whether Wexford has the sense to withdraw before he is publicly humiliated, or the folly to press on and be humiliated in open court. And knowing the man, Julian added dryly, Pruitt inclines to think it will be the folly. For a long moment Margaret said nothing. The weight she had carried 3 weeks did not so much lift as shift, become at last a thing she could stand upright beneath. She thought of the old woman's black eyes, sharp as a jackdaw's to the very last, and of all the letters she had carried down the lane to the post, with never a thought of what firm, careful sentences they held. She named me. She gave her reasons. Even dead, even gone into the cold vault beneath the church, the dowager had reached out one imperious hand to steady her. Thursday, Margaret said. Thursday, Pruitt comes down, and he means to see Osric and Cordelia together, with a witness, and lay the whole of it before them plainly, the letters, the witnesses, Cathcart, all of it, and give them the one chance they will get to withdraw quietly. Whether they take it is their affair. He settled his wet hat again upon his head. But you are to know tonight that the thing is not what it has seemed. You have not been standing alone against them. There have been 3 of us these 3 weeks, Pruitt in London gathering his sheaf, and Cathcart sharpening his temper, and I, walking up and down, cursing my own caution, and waiting for the day I might tell you so. He hesitated. I have told you so now. Badly, but I have told you. She looked at him then, full in the face, this grave, dark man standing bare, headed in the rain, because he would not for another day let her think herself friendless, and she felt something turn over in her that had nothing to do with codicils or courts. But she marked it, and put it by, to be looked at when the storm had passed. Then I shall be ready for Thursday, she said, and found that her voice was steady again, and her back was straight, and the fog about the house had thinned a very little. Thank you, Mr. Hartwell. I do not think you know what you have done. I know exactly what I have done. I have been 3 weeks too late in doing it. And he offered her his arm, there in the yew walk, quite openly, for any watcher in any window to make of it whatever spiteful thing they chose. And after the smallest hesitation, with the rain coming down and Thursday coming on and the whole neighborhood's whispers ranged against her, Margaret Ashcombe took it. Thursday came, and with it Mr. Pruitt, dry and unhurried as ever. He saw the Wexfords together in the library, with a clerk to witness, and laid the whole of it before them plainly, the copperplate codicil, the sworn men of law, Cathcart's flinty testimony, and, last, the 3 letters in the dowager's own hand in which she set down her purpose and her scorn in words no court would mistake for the wanderings of a failing mind. He gave them their one chance to withdraw quietly, and warned them of the cost and public ruin of pressing on. Osric's bluster held perhaps a quarter of an hour, and then broke, And Cordelia, who had understood the game the moment the first letter was read, sat white and silent and knew she had lost. They did not press on. Within the month they had gone up to town, and the neighborhood, so ready to believe the worst, discovered with the ease of such places that it had always known the truth. And the whispers turned, as whispers do, and found other quarry. The morning came up clear over Havering, the first true morning of spring, and Margaret Ashcombe stood at the low gate of the dower house with the key cold in her ungloved hand. It was a small key, plain iron, worn smooth by other hands across other years, and it turned in the lock with a soft, obliging click, as though the house had only been waiting to be asked. She did not go in at once. She stood a moment on the threshold stone and looked back down the sloping lane, where the elms were putting out their first pale green and the rooks were busy in the high branches, as they had over that same avenue for 100 springs before her. Behind her lay the great gray bulk of Havering Court, half a mile off across the park. She had entered that house that first gray afternoon by the servant's side, a paid attendant with nothing to her name but a straight back, a clean conscience, and the memory of a father lately laid in the ground. Now she stood before a door that was her own. The dower house was not large. It had been built, Mrs. Fenn had told her, for a widowed lady of the family 2 generations back, and had stood mostly shut since. It was a square, honest house of weathered stone, with a good slate roof and a walled garden gone to a sweet wildness of neglect, at the pleasant edge of the park, where the great avenue gave way to open fields. From its upper windows one could see the church tower of the village and, beyond, the blue smudge of the far hills. It was, Margaret thought, exactly the sort of house a sensible woman might be content to grow old in, and the thought did not frighten her in the least. She pushed the door wide and went in. The hall smelled of dust and old wood and the faint sweetness of beeswax, for Mrs. Fenn had sent 2 housemaids down the week before to open the windows and set the rooms to rights. The Holland covers were gone. The furniture stood revealed, dark and solid, and a little old-fashioned, good plain pieces made when things were made to last. A clock ticked somewhere in the quiet. On the table in the parlor someone had set a blue jug of early daffodils, gathered from the tangle of the garden, and at the sight of them Margaret stopped quite still, and something rose in her throat that she had to swallow down before she could go on. It was such a small kindness. But she had lived a long time now upon small kindnesses, and had learned to know their weight. She went through the rooms one by one, learning the house as one learns the face of a friend one means to keep. Upstairs were 3 bedchambers, and she chose for herself not the largest but the one that faced east, so that the morning would find her first. She stood at its window a long while, looking out over the waking garden, and thought of her father. He would have liked this room. He had been a man of small means and large contentments, a country parson who had buried the poor and married the young of 3 parishes for 30 years, and had died at last with scarcely £50 to his name and a shelf of well-thumbed books and the love of every soul who had known him. He had left her nothing but her name and the plain principles he had lived by, and for a time those had seemed a thin enough inheritance to face the world with. She had gone out to earn her bread among strangers, and swallowed slights and held her tongue and kept her dignity, because he had taught her that a person's worth lay not in what was done to them, but in what they themselves chose to do. And now, by no scheming of her own, by nothing but the plain fact of having been kind to a hard old woman whom nobody else would trouble to be kind to, she stood in a house of her own, a gentlewoman at last in fact as well as in blood. She thought her father would not have been proud. Exactly, he had distrusted pride. But he would have been glad. He would have sat by her fire and looked about him at the plain good rooms and said, in his mild way, that the Lord was not always slow to set things right, and then asked her whether she had remembered the poor of the parish, and she would have been able to answer, now, that yes, she had. For she meant that whatever she had, however modest, should be opened a little to those who had less, as her father's door had always stood open. It was the truest way she knew to honor him. She was still standing there when she heard, faint and far below, the sound of the gate. She knew the step before she reached the stairhead, an unhurried, even tread, the walk of a man who was seldom in a hurry and never idle. She went down more slowly than she needed to, and by the time she reached the hall the door stood open on the bright morning, and Julian Hartwell was on the threshold, his hat in his hand, looking in. He did not come in uninvited. That was like him. He stood in the doorway with the green light behind him, tall and dark and grave, and when he saw her, he inclined his head. Miss Ashcombe. I hope I don't intrude. Mrs. Fenn told me you meant to take possession today, and he paused, and she saw with a small private astonishment that this composed man was not entirely at his ease. I wish to see that everything was in order. The chimneys have all been swept, and I've had Coombe look to the garden wall on the north side. A stone or two had come down over the winter. You are very good. You have been very good from the first. No, he said it at once, as though it were important to be exact. I have been nothing that ought to be remarked. It was owed you. He turned his hat once in his hands. May I come in? Of course. Please. He stepped over the threshold and stood in the hall, looking about him with the frank assessing eye of a man who had a steward's care for stone and timber. Some of the constraint went out of his shoulders. It's a good house. Sound. My great-uncle built it well. He built everything well. It was the one thing he and I ever agreed upon. A faint, dry humor moved at the corner of his mouth and was gone. You'll be comfortable here, I think. I think I shall be very comfortable, more comfortable than I had any right to expect. A year ago, at that a shadow crossed his grave face. They both knew what the year had held. The long, slow dying at the court, the vigil and the patience of it, and then the ugliness, Osric's fury, Cordelia's smiling poison dropped in every willing ear. The whispers that had followed Margaret through the village like a smell of smoke. She had been called an adventuress, a schemer, a designing woman who had cozened a dying woman out of what belonged by right to her blood. She had borne it in silence, and let the law speak. And the law had spoken. The sealed codicil had held, every clause of it, drawn up in secret in the old woman's own sharp hand and lodged safe in London beyond the reach of grasping fingers, firm as the stone of the house she now stood in. They've gone up to town, I hear, Julian said at last. Wexford and his wife. For good this time. He found the neighborhood grown cold to him. There was no triumph in his voice, only a kind of weary distaste, the distaste of a decent man for an indecent business. You'll not be troubled by them again. I am glad, Margaret said, and found it was true, though not in the way of victory. She had no wish to have triumphed over anyone. She only wished to be let alone to live quietly and rightly, and now, it seemed, she would be. They walked out together into the garden, for the morning was too fine to waste indoors. The walled garden lay in a warm hush, sheltered from the wind, and the sun had drawn out the smell of turned earth and green things growing. It had been let go, but not ruined. Under the tangle of last year's growth, Margaret could see the good bones of it, the box hedges only half wild, the old espaliered pear against the south wall, the herb beds waiting to be reclaimed. Bees were already busy in a drift of crocuses by the path. "It wants work," Julian said, looking at it with his steward's eye. "It wants only patience," said Margaret. "And I have a good deal of that, and a great deal of practice." He looked at her then, and something in the look made her turn her face a little away, toward the pear tree on the wall. There had been, all through the long winter, a thing between them that neither had spoken of. It had lived in glances across the sick room, in small, unnecessary courtesies, in the way he had walked with her back from church of a Sunday through the cold. She had understood it perfectly, and had put it away from her, folded and unopened, because in those days there had been an impossible gulf between them. He was a gentleman with a name and a place. She had been a paid companion without a shilling of her own, whom the world would have said had angled after him exactly as it now said she had angled after the old woman for her money. She would not have had him think, even for an instant, that she had raised her eyes to him out of want, and so she had given him nothing to hope from, all through the winter, though it had cost her more than anyone knew. But the gulf was gone now. She had a house and an income and a settled independence. She stood on ground of her own. If she looked at him now, no one, not the meanest gossip in the village, not her own scrupulous conscience, could say she looked up at him from below. "Miss Ashcombe," Julian said, and stopped, and began again. "Margaret." He had never used her name before. It fell between them into the warm silence like a stone into still water, and the rings of it spread out and out. "I have something I have wanted to say to you for a great while. I did not say it before because I would not have had you feel yourself pressed or beholden when you had so little, and the difference between us might have made a hard thing harder. It would not have been honorable then. You understand me, I think. You always understand me." "I understand you," Margaret said, very low. "But there is no difference now," he went on, and his grave voice was not quite steady. "You stand in your own house, on your own land, beholden to no one living. And so I may say it, at last, and you may answer me as freely as you please, and turn me away if you please, and no shadow of obligation need touch it." He drew a breath. "I have loved you, I think, since the first hard frost, when I saw you sit for 3 hours in the cold, reading to that impossible old woman without one word of complaint, turning the pages so gently, as though she were something precious, when she had done nothing all afternoon but abuse you. I thought then that I had never seen anything so quietly brave, and I have thought it every day since. I am not a man who says such things easily. I dare say I say them very ill. But I would be honored beyond anything I know how to tell you if you would consent, in your own time and at your own pace, to let me court you, properly, as you deserve to be courted." The bees hummed in the crocuses. Somewhere beyond the wall a thrush had begun to sing. Margaret found that her eyes had filled, and she let them, and did not turn away this time, but looked at him full and steady, this grave, reserved, honorable man who had loved her in silence through a whole hard winter and had waited, out of a delicacy she had not known a man could possess, until the very day she was free, that she might answer him as an equal and not a dependent. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, and her voice shook and she let it. "Julian, you need not court me to teach me my own heart. I have known it as long as you have known yours. I could not let it be seen before. I could not have borne to be thought." She stopped. He nodded. He knew what she could not have borne. "But I may say it now, as freely as you have said it. And I do say it, yes, with all my heart, yes, and gladly, and with no hurry, for we have all the spring before us, and I find I am in no haste at all to have done with the courting. For a moment neither of them moved or spoke. Then Julian Hartwell, that self-possessed man, put out his hand, and she gave him hers, and he raised it and held it a moment against his bowed head, not quite kissing it, only holding it there, as though he could not otherwise trust himself, and then he straightened, and a slow, rare, transforming smile broke over his grave face, and made him for a moment almost young. "Then I am the most fortunate man in England," he said simply, "and I shall spend a great many years trying to deserve it." They did not rush it after that. That was not their way, either of them. He came to see her often through that spring and summer, and they would sit in the reclaimed garden among the herbs and the mended box hedges, or walk the lanes where they had walked so often that difficult winter, only now with no gulf between them and nothing left unsaid. He brought her cuttings for the garden and books for the long shelves, and once a pair of doves for the empty coat by the wall, and she teased him gently for the sentiment of it, and he bore the teasing with a grave pleasure. Mrs. Fenn, when the news at last was known, permitted herself to be pleased, in her tight-lipped way, and said only that it was no more than had been coming a long time, and that some things, if you waited for them properly and did not grasp, came right in the end. It was as near to a benediction as Mrs. Fenn had ever given anything, and Margaret Ashcombe, in her own house, on her own land, with her father's memory honored at last and a good man's love bright before her, found that the long cold season of her life had turned, quietly and without fanfare, into spring. She had lost her father and her home, and had gone out among strangers with nothing. She had been slighted and slandered and used hard, and through the whole of it she had kept the one thing that had ever truly been hers to keep, her honor and her plain kindness, and her refusal to be made cruel by cruelty. She had not schemed for any of what had come to her. She had only been, day after ordinary day, exactly what her father had raised her to be. And it had been enough. It had, in the fullness of time, been more than enough. In the evenings now she would sit by her own fire, in the low parlor with the daffodils, or later the roses, in the blue jug on the table, and hear the doves settling in the cote outside, and the clock ticking its patient time. And she would think of the sharp-tongued old woman sleeping now in the family vault, who had trusted her when she trusted no one else on earth, and had put her name in secret into that sealed and stubborn page. She wept for her sometimes now, quietly and without bitterness, in the safe contentment of her own hearth, for the lonely, imperious old creature who had, in the one true act of a hard life, reached out from the very edge of the grave to lift up the one person who had shown her plain human kindness, and set her, gently and rightfully, where she belonged. It was, Margaret thought, the nearest thing to grace she had ever been permitted to witness. Outside, the spring deepened over Havering. The elms came into full leaf, and the thrush sang in the evenings from the top of the mended wall, and down the long avenue. Most evenings, at the hour when the light turned gold, a tall, grave man in a dark coat came walking toward the small stone house at the edge of the park, where a straight-backed woman with calm gray eyes stood waiting for him at her own gate, in no hurry, with all the years before them.